So good to have you all together. We have what I'm going to refer to as an advanced class today. Maureen forgot the most important part of my whole biography. The rest is just fluff, and that's that I'm a former screener, screener supervisor, screener instructor, and an expert witness in the courts for screening cases. So most of my work, a lot of my work is in emergency behavioral health, like you. And we've kind of tailored this program to screeners today and other people involved in sort of crisis and emergency work. Although if you're not in that line of work, certainly there's other things in the program that are going to be relevant to you. Two things in the program, Maureen mentioned, you have the slides, and we'll have the slides, so keep your note-taking to a minimum. And also there's different references and citations in the slides. And we also put an article from one of my colleagues, Dr. John Roselle, Jack, out at University of Pittsburgh, who runs the crisis unit, the screening center there. He's an emergency psychiatrist. And his article about the role of screeners, essentially, in the prevention and response to targeted violence, which is our theme today. So we have a fast-moving program. I will tell you, got a lot going on in my court today. So although we do not have a formal break scheduled, I may have to pause quickly for a short phone call if I get a call from a specific hospital. So other than that, that's my apology up front if I do need to take a quick break, and I'll try to make it as quick as possible. As you would imagine, any discussion of violence, especially mass violence, does involve some pretty hairy stuff. So if anything in the program kind of pushes your buttons emotionally, please take a break. Come back to the program as you can at your own comfort, but do take care of yourself. Do the program. There's nothing in here for shock value. But obviously, as I said, the whole theme is about mass violence or targeted violence. The other thing to get out of the way quickly is there's kind of a feeling in the field of threat assessment that we shouldn't use the names and the images of offenders, perpetrators, because it can in some ways feed into their sense of seeking fame or notoriety. Obviously, that's true when we publish their names and information in the press and the media to the public. When I'm speaking to a professional group like yourselves, you do need to know the names. You do need to see the images because, for example, if someone's making reference to Elliot Rodger, probably one of the most notorious incel killers, sort of thing that we're going to touch lightly on today, just reference to that person's name or image is unto itself a risk indicator that our person of concern is perhaps following, interested, studying previous shooters like that. So for our purposes, we will use names and images. As I said, I would not be doing that if I was speaking to a PTL meeting this morning, but for professionals, we're going to go there. So obviously, this doesn't require any explanation. We're in a place anymore where either we're just coming off of the last mass shooting, maybe this is up at Brown University, or we're kind of always holding our breath and waiting for the next. So these aren't really questions of will there be another, instance of mass violence. The question is really more, the where and the when of it and what degree of readiness we will be in it. Today is about left of bang. Today is mostly about prevention. And as I said, it's a fairly advanced class, which means I'm going to introduce you to some of the basics of BTAM, Behavioral Threat Assessment and Management, which is different than the clinical assessment of dangerousness we normally do in a psych emergency setting or a psych crisis unit. And I want you to understand those differences. But beyond that, we're going to talk about two different components. One, we're going to talk about a new category of violent extremists designated by the FBI, known as NVEs, or nihilistic violent extremists. Talk a little bit about what that looks like here in Jersey, some of the cases we've had. And then we're going to talk about the role of humiliation in targeted violence. And the reason I'm bringing both of these, into our discussion today is we're encouraging anyone who's involved in the assessment of dangerousness or violence risk to be knowledgeable about these emerging trends. So as I said, I'm going to start with some basic concepts in BTAM. Lots of you have that information. There's lots of good places to get training in that. And I'll point those out to you if you haven't been through that sort of thing. But we're going to go into some newer trends, that probably haven't received as much press. Targeted violence. You're hearing more and more of that term being used in the wake of any sort of mass attack. You've heard it, whether it was in the assassination of Charlie Kirk, you've heard it in the attack, as I said, at Brown University. It's become a more general kind of catch-all term. The Department of Homeland Security really defines it as any sort of premeditated act. So it's not an impulsive, rageful act, as you'll see. It's something in which the subject has been thinking and planning, and we're going to look at the pathway to violence in just a moment. It is something in which we do see some behaviors and communications that at an empirical level associate with, tell us that someone may be on that pathway, perhaps give us some insight into where on the pathway they may be, and if they're potentially accelerating towards an imminent sort of risk. So the term we'll be using today fairly interchangeably will be this targeted violence and mass violence terminology to mean the same sort of thing. And obviously, while predominantly it's gun violence, it's not exclusively gun violence. We have instances in which the vehicle has been a knife, a bomb, a vehicle, combinations of those sorts of things. But it is really, again, something that's purposeful. And as you'll hear in a few moments, a term we use, something that's predatory as opposed to affective violence. Now, there's lots going on today. You don't need to, have me go over the current newscasts of everything that's going on everywhere. We will not be talking about mass violence in the context of war or genocide today, but some of the other bullet points you see here on the screen, shooting events, bombings, vehicle rammings, as I said, other things of this nature do kind of fall in that category of potential means of targeted violence. So let's start here. If you've ever been in the training with me, I start here in almost every one of my trainings. It's Lewin's equation. Many of you remember Dr. Kurt Lewin is the father of social psychology, had famously said, the human behavior is a function of the interaction between a person and their environment, the person or group and their environment. And you can apply that to anything you're watching on the news today. And you could think about all the different drivers, perhaps, we have of those sorts of risks at the moment. When we think about, ongoing health risks, there's still people dealing with COVID today, RSV, flu. There's all kinds of health stuff on people's minds. Military conflicts are just everywhere at the moment. Economic factors are on everyone's minds. We're having lots of debate around that in the States. You see riots in the street today in Iran about economic factors. Political tensions, again, without getting into it and staying as apolitical as possible, everywhere. Climate anxiety for many people, especially younger people, is a real issue. So we're going to see that right now we're in an era here in the States. I'm going to speak about this primarily from a US-centric standpoint for the rest of our program, of increased political violence. We've seen political violence against targets who have been on the right end of the political spectrum, targets who've been on the left end of the political spectrum, and things breaking out kind of all over the place. And as part of that, we're seeing a rise in this nihilistic violence, what I referred to before as NVEs, or nihilistic violent extremists. So we're going to dig into that concept very deeply in the next few moments. Now, this snapshot was taken back in October. And as I said, unfortunately, lots going on with me. Today, the last few days, I wasn't able to update this particular slide. But we see last year, actually, active shooter events were down slightly over the year, but this is a persistent risk. We have, as I said, in the States, an ongoing threat, persistent risk of mass violence that none of us really need to be reminded of. So let's start talking about how we understand targeted violence as being different than other sorts of violence risk. And let's talk about how our assessment of this risk looks a little different from screening and assessment of dangerousness to self, others, property, to how it looks in terms of violence assessment through the lens of BTAM, or behavioral threat assessment and management. The first concept, which I think obviously you should be comfortable, with you, is in this context, people don't just snap. You're all familiar with the idea of the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that certainly implies that something's building over time. We hit a critical tipping point, and then we may see violence. If you're someone outside the picture, it may look sudden, impulsive. You hear the term about being senseless violence. From the standpoint of the attacker, the violence is not senseless. It feels justified, and maybe the person believes there's no other alternative. They have been planning and developing the attack method for a while. It is anything but spontaneous. It's anything but, kind of senseless from their standpoint. So we're going to look at this as targeted violence. And in the context of everything I say to you this morning, go back to this idea, Steve's speaking just about targeted violence, not every kind of violence. In targeted violence, people don't snap. This is a process. This is predatory violence as opposed to affective violence. Affective violence, I want you to think about something like road rage. The person just loses it, right? So think about someone who freaks out at the shopping center because they think you took their special parking spot they were waiting for. I know that kind of thing like never happens in Jersey, but just, work with me here. So the person just loses it. They're out of their car, they're yelling and screaming at you, they're banging on the car hood. They're just a literal hot mess. You have elevations in ANS, autonomic nervous system arousal, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. If you asked them later, they probably wouldn't remember much of what they said at all. They just lose it. So in this way, it's a loss of control. It's kind of related to our, sympathetic nervous system response, fight and flight sort of stuff. You could drill down and look at this at a neuroscience level and kind of see all that activation. But when we talk about targeted violence, it's predatory violence. When we look at the attacks, how do we look at attacks? We have eyewitness reports. We have CCTV security footage. Sometimes we have increasingly attackers who live stream their attacks. And in these attacks, you see the attacker is cool and calm and collected and methodical. And as I said, if you look at that graphic, they move along a fairly predictable pathway. If you even go back to what's emerging about the Brown University attacker a few weeks ago now, it looks like he has been planning this a very, very long time. And that grievance he had with other professionals, with the university environment, with researchers, kind of festers, sorts of marinates in that, develops and simmers over time, more of a smoldering crisis than a sudden crisis. And we do not have that elevation, as I said, of ANS, of autonomic nervous system arousal. The person presents, even during the attack, as calm and composed. So in the affective zone, we have a person who's losing control. In the predatory zone, which is targeted violence, we have a person who's taking control. And this is a very, very key difference. And part of this, from a screening standpoint, is the idea when someone comes to psych emergency, one of our, kind of perennial questions to people is, well, what's happening today? And from a standpoint of targeted violence, there may not be anything very significant today in the way of a threat, but someone is demonstrating these behaviors and movement along the pathway towards an attack. And in BTAM, and this is an important orientation, it is not based on if someone has made a threat. It's based on someone who poses a threat. And in this realm, we know someone poses a threat when they manifest very specific behaviors and communications that correlate at a statistically significant level with these markers that tell us that someone is A, on the pathway, and B, moving along the pathway. So we're doing a lot, cross-pollinating. Part of my work is getting out and talking to other mental health professionals and educating them about BTAM and about targeted violence. And the other part of my work is working with the other law enforcement agencies, working with the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, working with the New Jersey statewide threat assessment team, and teaching them about the assessment of dangerousness from a clinical standpoint. So when we have a person of concern that we share, that this person who's on our radar from a threat assessment standpoint lands in the psych emergency room, we can look through a shared lens. We could use the same terminology. And that's why we're spending a little bit of time right now. And someone asked before, is this the same, presentation I've done before or I'll be doing again? The answer is, yeah, if you've seen me speak on this, it's going to be the same because I want to get some of these basics out to you every time we speak. So this morning, as I said, a little bit of these basic concepts, which is where we still are, and then on to these emerging trends of nihilistic violent extremists and on to humiliation. So this is what the pathway looks like. The pathway was first developed by Weston and Calhoun in 2003, and it's been adopted by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security along the way. And it really is the dominant model today, both here in the States and internationally, in looking at this movement towards an act of targeted violence. Most important for our discussion right now is to understand that the entry point to this is grievance. Now, obviously, there's a lot of people, even in a room right now, a Zoom room of 141 people, there's a lot of us that have different grievances. But very few of us, other than mumbling and grumbling about them, are going to go on and do anything about that. We're not going to become violent. But there is a subset of people who start to manifest kind of violent ideations and fantasies. That thought process, why I ought to do this and I ought to do that. And they can kind of very much smolder or marinate in that thinking as well. And again, the vast majority do not advance beyond just that ideation and that fantasy to actual kinetic violence. But there is an important subset of people who start to move further and moving from those stages into what we'll refer to as a pre-operational stage, in which they're starting to put an attack plan together. They're starting to do research and hostile surveillance on their targets. They're starting to acquire the materials, whether those are weapons or body armor or explosives, et cetera, and then a movement gradually there. Now, for our standpoint, two things to kind of clarify. One, it's not an absolutely linear and sequential process. There are people who can skip steps. There are people who can backtrack. And most importantly, on this slide is the blue arrow in the background that's pointing in both directions. And what that kind of signifies is it's not a foregone conclusion when someone kind of starts to progress along this pathway that it has to end with violence or some sort of attack. People can be de-escalated. We can take different interventions to make the situation safer. So as I said, not a foregone conclusion that it's going to end badly, but the person very often is on this trajectory. So we know there's a lot of different, again, empirically based sort of markers. We're not going to dig into every one of these. I want to talk about which are the commonalities that should just grab you. You know, I want to talk about one for a moment that's like kind of on here. And the case study that's so illustrative of this would be Aaron Alexis, who was the shooter in the Navy Yard. Alexis wasn't a terrorist. Alexis wasn't a disgruntled worker. Alexis was psychotic, and he was experiencing what we refer to as threat control override symptoms. He felt threatened from the outside that the government was attacking him with radio waves and destroying him and controlling his mind. He felt threatened from the inside that he was being controlled and destroyed, et cetera, and got to a place where he felt the only way to stop this government destruction of him was to attack a government facility, and hence the attack as he was working at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. This is, again, several years ago. There are things like that as mental health professionals, something like threat control override symptoms, that we know almost always end badly. So if we look at some research, we'll take two things really quick. We'll take the research of Douglas, who says that people are at their most violent potential when they're psychotic. And then we'll look at the research of Swanson, who took a meta-analysis of 204 other studies and said, when you add threat control override symptoms to that psychosis, it doubles that risk, again, statistically, of violence. So there are things like that, that as assessors of dangerousness, we should always be listening for, we should always be looking for. And in this, next block of instruction that we're talking about right now, that's kind of my intention, to say to you, if you hear these things, you have to understand their association with violence risk, but very specifically targeted violence risk. So let's jump in and kind of talk about those things. Kind of backtracking just a step, as I said, in BTAM, Behavioral Threat Assessment and Management, which is where we're drawing that, this research and that model of the pathway, et cetera. This is about who poses a threat, not necessarily who makes a threat. You see this every day. We see some people who make threats, they're never going to do anything about it. We see people who sometimes do deadly and dangerous things, have never made a threat. And we obviously see people on occasion who do both, make threats and carry them out and act on those threats. And it's not always possible for us to know. You, of course, are very familiar with the idea of faking good and faking bad. People could pull it together in front of you, pull it together in front of the psychiatrist pretty easily, and present themselves as being fairly intact. So we're not waiting for a threat. And this is really the crossover where we're looking at how BTAM models link up with clinical assessments of dangerousness, from a screening standpoint. So a few things to think about we always want to do when we're considering targeted violence risk. First, we want to take a holistic approach, and you see this represented in the graphic, that we're always concerned, primarily with our person of concern. We're going to call that person our subject, but we also have to be concerned with the target, the environment they exist in, and any triggers or precipitants that may accelerate the risk towards violence. So let me explain very quickly why. And this is referred to as the threat assessment dilemma. And the threat assessment dilemma goes like this. Once a person And you have to remember, this is not just about people sitting in front of you in psych emergency. This is someone in the workplace, the school system, the community who is, raising behaviors of concern and somehow gets on our radar for this sort of assessment. Once a subject becomes aware they are on our radar, the dilemma is this. Some people are going to cool off. They're going to say, oh man, the cops, the system, my employer, they're on to me. I need to, dial it down. I don't want to get in trouble. I have to cool it. The second option, though, is the person may feel a time imperative or an action imperative that, oh man, I'm on their radar. If I'm going to act, I have to act soon. I have to do this right away. And it actually accelerates the risk of violence. And that's the reason that we're also assessing the vulnerability of the target, because we have to make sure the target is safe before we really start poking around at the subject, because it may accelerate or amplify that risk. The environment, as I said, how they are associated, what kind of environment they're in, do they have proximity to each other, et cetera. And as I said, those precipitating targets. But these are what we always want to assess, these 5 factors, from a behavioral threat assessment standpoint. Risk factors, which you are very aware of, right? So these are actuarial. We look at these and these are statistically known. If a person has these things and they're static, they're part of a person's history. They have a history of violence. They have a history of substance abuse. They have a history of these things. That history is unchangeable. We can't go back and rewrite their personal history. That's part of their profile. And I'm using profile in a very loose term here. I'm not using it in a demographic sort of way, because demographics don't play a role in this. When we apply any kind of real profiling in threat assessment, we end up with way too many false positives for it to be useful. So there's no nexus with profile until we're doing it. But from a risk factor standpoint, you're familiar, and we'll talk about this in the next 1 or 2 slides. You're familiar and you're looking for risk factors all the time. Triggers and stressors, we're always looking for what's going on in your life, what's happening today, what's in the near term that may increase or decrease the risk. But I want to talk to you about warning behaviors and warning behaviors related to imminence for a few moments, because the terminology, warning behaviors, means something very, very specific from a behavioral threat assessment standpoint. And it's not the generic use of the term, as I'll explain in a moment. But in the interest of accuracy, fairness, and thoroughness, we also have to assess what sort of mitigators are there that actually may reduce the risk. The person has a lot of social connections. They have future orientation. They have a good support system. They're in treatment. They're compliant with their treatment, et cetera. There are things that may actually reduce risk too. And we want to know those, as well as threat enhancers, the things that may actually escalate the risk. So some of the risk factors, and I just want to touch on this, quickly, because this is going to be kind of, I think, old school for you, is the idea that, as I said, these are static. These are actuarial factors about the person, history of violence, exposure to violence, previous sorts of mental health struggles. You are all familiar with the literature, things like the MacArthur study that says that people with mental illnesses are not necessarily more likely than anyone else in our community, more likely to be victims than perpetrators. But we know in certain instances, yes, certain disorders, especially coupled with certain substances, can raise that risk. So we look at it as a contributing factor as opposed to a causal factor. And of course, other things like, does the person have access to weapons? That's going to change our risk equation, if they have guns or other things at their availability. You also see in this graphic some of the higher risk behaviors that start to speak to us more about our level of concern, what we'll call our LOC. And that's an absence of any guardrails, perceiving, projecting blame and feeling victimized by others, not caring for themselves in a whole range of different ways. But you see some of these as risk factors. Now, some of these, as I said, are commonalities. This is a fantastic study if you have a personal or professional interest in violence and violence prevention, which was done a few years ago by the known as the Violence Project, done by the National Institute of Justice. There were 4 major findings. And the most important of these is the one right on the screen right now, is there is no clear profile that emerges for someone who would be a mass shooter or a perpetrator of targeted violence. But there are important commonalities. The first of these, which again may make sense to you, is kind of ACEs, is the individual had a exposure to very adverse childhood experiences or trauma at a young age. And those things could be a whole range of abuse and neglect and violence in the home, substance abuse in the home, again, different traumatic experiences themselves and their families in their childhood. The second commonality was prior to the actual attack, and notice the term here in the research, this is a very big N, every mass shooter had some sort of identifiable crisis point in the weeks or months leading up to the shooting. And that's a place where we might be seeing that person from a psych emergency standpoint. The other thing you see in the second paragraph here is in many instances, there is leakage, a term that you may be familiar with, one of our warning behaviors, in which the person is starting to communicate with other people their interest and their intent in committing some sort of shooting or violence. So the third of these, and this is very important from a risk standpoint, was that the person is obsessed with and studying other shooters. So that's why I use some of the names, talk about using names and images in the program, is if someone says to us, oh, my son, my daughter, my partner, whoever it is fascinated with mass shooters, they're online, they study them, they know all about them, they know about the attack, the weapons, the casualties, all of these things, that they're, again, focused in that way. We know that that's a very significant warning, sort of indicator for us. And the fourth commonality is kind of self-evident. The person has the means. They have the skill, the will, and the access to weapons to carry out some sort of attack. With this sort of violence, it is most often a legally owned weapon. If it's an adolescent or a underage person, it's usually a weapon owned by family members or friends that they somehow have access to. If it is an adult, it's usually a weapon that they have legally purchased in some way. So this is different than street crime in a number of different ways. So understand some of those commonalities, and they fall under the domain of those risk factors. But I wanted to get into the warning behaviors for a few moments. Warning behaviors is a slightly different way of looking at this. And I want to point you here. Remember, you have these slides to the article from Dr. Reed Malloy out in San Diego, and his article going back a few years, the role of warning behaviors in threat assessment. It's probably the best article of its type. And Malloy and his associates developing this model, looking at these kind of behaviors very, very specifically associated with targeted violence. So let's talk about it for a moment. The way the terminology is used here with warning behaviors is similar to our weather system, right? So if the weather forecaster said to you today, there's a tornado watch, they would be saying to you, there are the conditions today, heat, humidity, whatever else it is, wind, that may give rise to a tornado. It's not here yet, but it's certainly a possibility. Keep your eyes open, be prepared, know what your plan is to go to the basement or do whatever you're going to do should the conditions become more pronounced. The warning is something different. It's saying the tornado is here. The tornado's cell is in the next county. It's in the next town. You need to take action and get to the basement now. So when we talk about warning behaviors, we talk about them in two ways: proximal, near term, that are telling us that this is something that is very likely associated with targeted violence. And the other is, a watch, which we're going to call the proximal warning behaviors, which you'll see. Now, I know there's a lot of content on this slide, and we're not going to get a chance to go through every one of the warning behaviors this morning. I'm going to ask you to look at this in your own time and check out those articles. But I want to talk about a few that are the most common. Some of the most common, as I said, the most common of all is number 6 here in the proximal category, which is leakage, which is telling other people. That could be online. It could be to a classmate or a coworker or a friend. It could be in other ways, starting to communicate to people about our intent. So if we look at something very, very well known, it would be Nicholas Cruz, the shooter in Parkland, Florida, back on Valentine's Day 2018. Cruz, in September 2017, posting online 2 things on YouTube. One, the statement, I'm going to be a professional school shooter. The next thing he posts is a video in which he says, "Hi, I'm Nicholas Cruz. I'm going to conduct an attack at Marjorie Douglas Stillman High School in Parkland, Florida, using an AR-15 tracer rounds, hoping for this many casualties." Explicitly in September, this is months and months before the attack, putting this online, a video about all of his intentions to commit this attack. You have to remember, Cruz had 37 visits from the sheriff's office to his home prior to this attack. He had 2 contacts with the FBI, tips called in about him. He was on everybody's radar, and still this thing goes down. So we see this kind of leakage very, very often. The others that are very common are fixation behavior and identification behavior. And I'm bringing those up because they're going to associate with our nihilistic violent extremist discussion that's coming up in just a moment. Fixation, not a romantic fixation, not a kind of pathological fixation where we normally use that term. This is someone who has a very angry preoccupation with a person or a cause. It can be about something they're protesting, something they don't like, pro this, anti that, whatever their belief system is. Or it could be a person. It could be a political figure, a celebrity, a person who's in their workplace, in their school system, but they have this intense focus, this fixation, in an angry way. As I said, this is never romantic, in an angry way that starts to deteriorate their personal and their professional functioning. They're giving so much mental energy, so much time to their anger with this situation that it starts to really deteriorate relationships, work performance, school performance, et cetera, et cetera. The next one, which is identification. Identification here meaning something different too. This is very specifically someone who associates with a military, paramilitary, law enforcement sort of mindset. They're into the paraphernalia, the language, the haircut, the sunglasses, collecting the weapons, speaking in the military sort of term, and they view themselves as being a warrior on behalf of a cause. Example, if we look at the shooter at the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs a few years ago, in his arraignment, he stands up in the courtroom, has only one thing to say: "I'm a warrior for the babies. I'm a warrior." So you're going to see this in the nihilistic violent extremists and other ways in just a few moments. If we have this person who's presenting, or their collateral information suggests from family, friends, et cetera, that they're completely, just absorbed in this kind of military mindset, they see themselves as a warrior on behalf of a cause, they're fixated on another person or a cause, as we said before, these things together are very concerning to us from a behavioral threat assessment standpoint. Now, as I said, we're not going to have time today to get into the distal sort of issues. Those are more like the watch phase than the warning phase. The warning signs are these 8 proximal warning signs from a behavioral threat assessment standpoint that always have meaning for us and suggest a person, again, may be on this pathway. A few others, again, just from a screening standpoint to be, I guess, keyed into. Obviously, as I said before, and coming out of the research from the Violence Project, the person who seems very interested, fascinated with violent topics, violent groups. This could be demonstrated through their online activity, through their reading, through their studying, in different ways. And many people we know, when we think about copycats and contagion, do draw inspiration, actually can even draw tactical guidance from previous attackers. So their interest in previous attackers, as I mentioned before, is very significant to us. The other thing we talk about is the intimacy effect. And this is real or perceived. Again, think about it being perceived. The person who believes they have some kind of intimate relationship with the target. Maybe they do, maybe they did, maybe they don't at all. It's just a fantasy for them. But the more they believe there's an intimate relationship between themselves and their target of violence, the more likely it is actually to be carried out. So as you're listening to their story of the person and their background and why they have made a threat perhaps, or exhibiting concerning behaviors towards a specific target, if they perceive a level of intimacy with the target, it's something that does raise our risk. I mentioned the threat assessment dilemma, so I'm not going to belabor this. Just know it's in the slide set if you do want to cycle back to that. And then we start to talk about some other concerns and imminence. 2 things I want to point out. One is the degree of organization. Now, obviously, we could have even people who are fairly psychotic pull off, very sophisticated attack plans and present in other ways as being disorganized. And sometimes we talk about this, from the standpoint of kind of functional psychosis. But organization, the level of kind of planning out their attack, fixation on their subject we spoke about, the focus, again, directing all their energy towards that person. And both the violent action imperative and time imperative. There's no other way than to commit violence, and I'm willing to use violence to resolve my grievance. And the time imperative, I have to do it soon. All of those increase the potential risk if the person feels pressure to do this before there is some sort of intervention that may prevent them from executing. So a good way to look at this is Gavin de Becker's model. I know many of you are familiar. If you haven't read de Becker's really a great book, The Gift of Fear, certainly on my reading list and hopefully for yours as well. De Becker's JACA model goes like this. If our subject is voicing justification for violence, well, they hurt me, they fired me, they ruined my life, or even from a delusional standpoint, they're out to get me, et cetera, et cetera. If they feel justified in using violence, we check this box. It raises that risk. A lack of alternatives. It's very funny. I think it's not funny, but interesting. Sometimes people will say, Steve, we're really concerned. We got a letter from this person. They're threatening to sue us. I say, hey, that's good to hear. What do you mean that's good to hear? It means they think there's other ways to address their grievances, other routes to satisfy their anger, their frustration. Besides violence, there's other ways. But when a person starts to see other alternatives, I've tried this, I've tried that, I've tried these other things, I've exhausted those. I can't get resolution to my perceived problem, painted in the corner, as it were, feeling kind of trapped, it raises the risk. Fear of consequences. If the person is fearless, they do not care if they're hurt or killed. They do not care if they're arrested and incarcerated. They disregard all these consequences. It raises our concern. And lastly, as I said earlier, the ability, the skill, the will, the intention, and the access to the means of committing the violence, those should all jump out at us as elevating our concerns for targeted violence risk. Now, here's our crossover into really the first of the advanced topics. And from my standpoint, as I said, I know many of you online are familiar with some of those BTAM concepts that I shared. For some of you, maybe they're new terminology, and I invite you to go back to those slides and dig in. dig into some of the citations and read those journal articles and share them with others on your team. But here's our crossover now into the more advanced topics, which we're going to talk about as being emerging trends. And the first of these are this new category of violent extremists designated by the FBI, known as nihilistic violent extremists, or NVEs. And I'll be using that acronym throughout this block of instruction. First of all, we're all familiar with the idea of someone who is philanthropic. Philanthropy is a love of humanity. Misanthropy, someone who's misanthropic, exhibits a hatred of humanity. And when we start to talk about these nihilistic violent extremists, this is where we are. We're talking about someone who is speaking about demonstrating an absolute hatred for humanity. Now, the concept of nihilism goes back to, ancient times. It's not a new thought. But if you had to define it, and you see really the definitions here, this viewpoint that current social and norms and mores, the way we live, are pointless and useless. Current traditional values and beliefs that our society runs on are absolutely meaningless. They're useless. And if you're going to do anything with your life, because your life is meaningless and your life is useless from this standpoint, if you're going to do anything with your life, the only thing that could be constructive would be the destruction of others around you, the destruction of society and the destruction of others. So it is violence for the sake of violence is a good way to kind of understand that. And this sometimes could be hard for us to understand from a more clinical perspective when you're saying, well, what's your motive? Who hurt you? What was wrong? Why do you feel this way? So it could be this very, and you see the graphic here of this kind of black pill idea from this idea that comes from the Matrix movies, this idea of red pills, blue pills, black pills, this very kind of doomeristic, fatalistic kind of idea. So the rise of nihilistic violent extremists, I'm going to talk to you about 3 or 4 known groups that are operational on the country and the world. Danielle, yes, we'll be giving you the slides. again, is primarily online communities. These are not groups that meet. They're not going on marches. They're not holding rallies. There's virtual communities, and they exist primarily in places like subreddits and Discord servers and other places on the deeper web, and sometimes even on the dark web. But their philosophy is really based on a hatred of society and this idea that life is meaningless. And their ultimate goal really is to indiscriminately sow as much chaos and destruction as possible. The mechanism for this, the tactics for this are very twisted and require illumination. They're not always obvious that you would associate this as kind of an ideology. So just this past year, last summer, this year, now we're 2026, last summer, 2025, the FBI formally recognized nihilistic violent extremists as an extremist ideology. And at that point, this was back in the summer, said they had over 250 open cases active in all 50 states in which they were pursuing investigations and charges against nihilistic violent extremists. And as I said, these are people primarily existing in virtual spaces. We have seen, and I'll point out some of these cases that you'll remember in the near term that have a nexus to nihilistic violent extremism. We've seen them in school shootings. We've seen them in other places, public shootings as well. They're not cases that are rare in some way. So when we think about it, there's 3 or 4 kind of communities you should be aware of, and you see a little bit of their symbology. You see some of the graphics, and I want you again to check this out and also continue to learn more about it, because when someone sits you down with an adolescent or a younger student and says, well, this is what's on their notebook, this is what's on their clothing. Again, these symbols, like knowledge of previous attackers' names and details about previous attacks, these should grab your attention. These should be indicators that the person may be, for a lack of a better term, kind of dabbling in these extremist communities. So at the most general way, we hear this referred to as the true crime community. And there's true crime communities of people who are following podcasts and following television, different programs about crimes. But these folks are much more locked in, fascinated with, and going even deeper. They're trading gore videos. They are involved in work that is desensitizing them, glorifying mass violence. And in these communities, there's a hierarchy. And in the hierarchy, you ascend to the higher levels by getting other people to do dangerous things or by doing dangerous things yourself, where you can rise to kind of sainthood, as it were, in these communities. So it's interesting. In the past, you would think about a mass shooter who was seeking infamy or notoriety. For example, if we take Cho, the shooter in Virginia Tech, so many years ago, sent a videotape he had made to himself of to NBC News during the shooting. Shot the first 2 people, stopped, went to the post office, mailed the video, came back and shot 33 more people. In this way, was looking for the whole world to know his name. In these nihilistic violent extremist environments, they don't want the whole world necessarily to know their name. They're seeking everybody in their community to know their name and to glorify them for their violence. So here again, this is primarily, not exclusively, the domain of younger people. I would say roughly early teens into early 20s, but not exclusively. And it is primarily, but again, not exclusively, a male kind of dominated, kind of pursuit. 2 or 3 of the names you should know are the 764 Network and No Lives Matter, as well as the Order of 9 Angles. This is not 9 angels. If you look at kind of the satanic, pentagram and other diagrams, it's about 9 angles. The 9 Angles group has a nexus with satanic thought and Nazism, as well as this other kind of violence. These people do a lot of, as you'll see in one of the cases, promoting other people who they are controlling to do very serious self-mutilization. We'll call that, in this circle, they call it fan signing. So if we were to see someone who's carved someone else's name in their arm, and it's very common in their chest, this is a person who may be a victim of one of these groups, and they're being used by the players in these groups to ascend in the ranks in the hierarchy by getting other people to do the self-mutilation, by doing childhood sexual abuse, sometimes even to infants, to siblings, other people in their home, for the purpose of capturing that evidence, taking photographs and videos, posting it in these online communities, and then ascending in these ranks. So this is very, very twisted sort of stuff. But you should be aware of these ideas: the true crime community, 764, no lives matter, and the order of nine angles at a minimum. If we look at just last year, we see 4 very clear cases that had a nexus to nihilistic violent extremists. And this starts in close proximity: the Evergreen High School shooting, the shooting on the first day of school at the Annunciation School in Minnesota, this shooting earlier that year at Antioch High School in Tennessee, and just before that, the Abundant Life Church shooting as well. All of those shooters, first of all, this is interesting. One, existed in the same communities, but also were in communication with each other. So here you start to see the networking component, that all of these people are not planning with each other, although they're not acting with each other. They're influencing each other. They're teaching each other. They're promoting each other and encouraging each other to commit this violence. They're, again, swapping sometimes usernames, presenting as the other person on these boards and in these forums. They are all swimming together in these pools. So if we go to a wider angle, you start to see kind of like what they are doing in these online communities: trading gore videos, trading what we call CSAM, childhood sexual abuse materials, in the form of videos. Now, I'll give you an example here. We had a case most recently, again, and I'm going to speak in the most generic terms possible, here in Jersey, where the offender was 12 going on 13 years old, had been arrested for trading child porn materials, had a digital crypto wallet he had set up on the dark web. Listen to the level of sophistication of this 12 to 13-year-old, was using crypto to buy, sell, and trade childhood sexual abuse materials online in these communities, because this is the currency of these communities, the childhood sexual abuse material, and having, demonstration, these videos of people committing this for the purpose of ascending in the ranks. So one, we know that these groups are using very horrific gore videos like beheadings, murder, suicide videos. We know, like porn addiction, this gore content also can become very addictive and compulsive. And we also know that it desensitizes the viewers and makes them perhaps more vulnerable to committing these kind of acts if they become desensitized to this sort of violence. So we're actually seeing this around us. We're seeing this in our schools, where we have kids who are part of a fandom community, for example, still very popular, of the Columbine shooters. We see them wearing the clothing that the Columbine shooters were wearing, like the Wrath t-shirt on the day the attacks were committed in Columbine. We see jewelry, and the locket that you see here from an arrest. The picture of Dylan Roof, the shooter, down at the Baptist Church in the Carolinas a few years ago. We see references to and the nicknames of the Columbine shooters. We see people making dog tags with the names of the Columbine shooters. And then again, these cases, as I said, very close to home. This case here last spring, in which we have, you see the U.S. Attorney General talking about these cases, but we had a case in Egg Harbor just about a month ago that mimics these exactly. So we have cases in Jersey, we have cases around the country, and we see this nexus to, again, these targeted violence cases. This is how it all comes together. The person you see shopping in the gun store here in this video is the individual who went on to commit the attack at the Annunciation School this spring, first day of school, this fall, first day of school back in September. Again, moving along the pathway. It's not someone who rolled out of bed, just snapped, committed this violence. It is someone who's festering in this environment. So if you kind of look at this as a loose kind of grievance, this misanthropic, nihilistic worldview, and this deep-seated desire for destruction, living in these online communities completely fans, the flames of this. Now, we're not going to read each one of these to you right now, but here's 4 or 5 cases in fairly close proximity of the same pattern of behavior. It's participation in the online communities. It's association with the different groups like Order of Nine Angles or 764. It is trading and dealing in childhood sexual abuse materials and gore videos, etc. And again, they seem to be a commonality even in things of execution of the attacks and where they're targeting. And those targets tend to be soft targets, schools, community sort of places that are target rich, but places that are symbolic, that represent something about society, whether it's a religious, it's a political affiliation, something again where the attacker views this as having a symbolic value, even though they don't necessarily have a grievance. So it's not the same thing where we could say about previous maybe school shooters, oh, they were bullied, kind of the classroom avenger model we take out of Columbine, back in the 90s. It is someone now who says, life is meaningless. I am not going to get a job, whether it's AI is taking our jobs, climate change is going to destroy the planet. The economy is such where I'm not ever going to succeed. I can never own a home. I'm never going to advance. Having these kind of fatalistic views creates that environment for some people that there's nothing to live for. And obviously, very well the correlation between hopelessness and danger to self and others in this way. So we can look at these cases, as I said, really as being all across the country, but not necessarily associated with a political ideology. We've seen attacks against high profile targets from the very far left to the very far right and everywhere in between. We've seen these people associated with different ideologies or no ideologies at all when it comes to the political spectrum. So it is, again, a different sort of attack in which it is not seeking fame from the entire, world. It's really seeking fame in a very narrow band of people, which are these online communities that foster this sort of thought and this sort of behavior. So again, the virtual community is very powerful. If you look at radicalization in the pre-9/11 era, most of it came from a very simple means we will call, I met a guy. I met a guy at the gym. I met a guy at the bowling alley. I met a guy at work. He talked to me about his beliefs. He gave me a brochure. He gave me a tape of listening to a lecture of someone. He gave me some of his propaganda. It all started to make sense to me. I met his friends and I slowly became indoctrinated into this group. That's not the way this works anymore. This sort of radicalization happens all alone, late at night, privacy of people's homes, on their screens. And if you think about how much screen time people have in general, especially younger people, and again, there is a connection with the impact of the pandemic and isolation, on this and loneliness. These things kind of have a connection. These are very powerful communities for these people who start to belong to, because once they get pulled in and they start to get rewarded and praised in these communities, it fuels them in many instances to try to become even deeper involved. And that means committing this sort of violence. And this, again, can be self-mutilation, promoting others to do self-mutilation, promoting or executing things like mass violence. So rather than being the loner, whose maybe just temperament is to be, more isolated, it's kind of that incompetent joiner who finds a place in these online worlds where they're not judged, where their beliefs are applauded, where they could ascend and achieve some degree of success. But what seems to be very common across the whole spectrum, you see in my bottom point here, is this kind of very profound, painful loneliness and a real pathological envy of other people who seem successful or happy in their lives. Now, it's not totally new as a dynamic, but it's very prevalent in these groups. So I want to give you a case example to bring it home. This is Bobby Crimo. Bobby Crimo was the shooter in Highland Park, Illinois on 4th of July. Now, a few years ago, you remember him dressed as a woman on the rooftop with a AR style gun, opened fire on a parade, a 4th of July parade, killed and injured a number of people there. Crimo had no association with other sorts of extreme ideologies. He had no He did not write a manifesto. He wasn't doing this for any specific cause. But when you looked at his online activity, when, in the investigation drilled in, you see him being very much part of these communities. Now, you can take this back to where we started before with some of the other risk indicators. Here in the photography, you see Cremo on a day where the kids were allowed to wear some kind of costumes to school, whether it's Halloween or otherwise. What's he wearing? Black tactical vest, black ballistic helmet, a GoPro mounted on the front of his helmet. You see him on the other end of the photographs here, the photograph on the right, he's in his bedroom. And you see him again in this militarized SWAT kind of gear, black ballistic helmet, black balaclava. He's got the GoPro camera mounted on his helmet. And you see the dog tags hanging on his mirror in the background. This is a kid. He hasn't been in the military. He hasn't been in law enforcement. But most importantly, you see him, the photograph or the drawing in the middle. This is something he posted online in one of the Discord servers. And you see the drawing of himself in the black helmet, in the vest, holding an AR style rifle with the GoPro camera drawn on his helmet. And we see this over and over. This has become the aesthetic. Now, years ago, we would say, oh, the aesthetic of the school shooter was something like the Columbine Mafia idea of wearing the black trench coat. And this kid had a grievance with the jocks or the freaks or whoever it was. But this is a different mentality. So if we take, for example, Salvador Ramos, who you see here, Salvador Ramos is the shooter in Uvalde, Texas. He was known by the nickname of the school shooter in his community prior to the shooting because he specifically cultivated this persona online. This becomes a career choice. These are disaffected young people who feel this is a path forward in life. Like Nicholas Cruz, I mentioned earlier, who posted online, I'm going to be a professional school shooter. So here you see him dressing, speaking in these channels or these communities, fostering and curating, as it were, this brand of being a mass shooter, and then ultimately within his world going on to do this. There's an absolute fixation with the aesthetics. So when mom and dad brings us someone and says, my son Johnny, my daughter Susie, whoever it is, they're obsessed with the Columbine kids. They wanted me to get, or I found in their room, not a gun, but they have an airsoft gun and they have the vest and they have the helmet and they're all in these kind of things. But they are very significant to us. This has become, in these worlds, in these communities, performance art. This has become performative. So if you think about this, I want to give you one example to start with. If we think about this, and I'm kind of hoping you haven't seen this, which is the attack of Brendan Tarrant on the two mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, now a few years back. Brendan Tarrant organized the attack in a way where it was more about making a video of killing people than actually killing people in the mosque out of his hatred of Muslims. I'll give an example of that in a moment. The camera mounted on his helmet gives you a specific point of view. You're seeing more and more of people writing in white writing on their black guns. Because when I hold that gun, it's in the line of view, the point of view of the video that's being taken. And you see the names of previous shooters and you see the symbology, the symbols of the different groups, et cetera, et cetera. So they are actually conducting this for the purpose of the video being made or the theatrics of it. So compared to Columbine, the cultural script has shifted. This graphic is not just a placeholder. That is an infographic of all the weapons, ammunition, incendiary devices, body armor worn by the attacker in Aurora, Colorado, the movie theater attack at the midnight showing of the Batman movie back again in 2012. When we look at the modern shooter, this is Isaiah Williams leaving a Days Inn in Phoenix in the summer of 2002. He's picked up on security camera, black vest, black helmet, GoPro, black gun, the whole kit. He has no manifesto. He has no reason that anybody he knows to do this, walks out the door in Phoenix and just cuts loose with 200 rounds against anybody and everything in his line of sight. This is Ashley Hale, in the school, the Covenant School in Nashville, spring of 2023. Black vest, 2 long black guns, handgun, following the same script. In that year, we had 5 self-replicating identical attacks in which the style of the attack, the aesthetics of the attack were identical. So this has to jump out at us as being very significant indicators of someone moving towards this pathway when we start to see what I referred to earlier in the kind of basics of BTAM as this militarized identification with this. So this is an identification with these groups, right? These nihilistic violence groups. It's an identification with their mindset, this kind of fatalistic, creating just violence for the sake of violence, not politically motivated, not ideologically motivated, motivated by this absolute hatred of humanity. We're seeing this replicate over and over again. So we want to sensitize you to that. So I'm going to pause for one moment in the chat window. Questions, comments, discussions about anything to do with the nihilistic violent extremists quickly. And if there are more complex questions, we'll stay online at the end of the program. But anything right now about nihilistic violent extremists or the basic BTAM concepts before we roll into humiliation. What a nice Monday we have, right? Let's move from nihilistic violent killers to humiliation. And I'll have some coffee in the meantime. Any questions, comments about all that happy stuff? Neil's laughing out loud. Okay, brother Neil.
So Steve, someone's asking about what about the apps?
Yeah, so these apps, they're asking about apps about flagging shooters, about what was the specific app question? It was earlier in the chat window.
Are the different apps monitored and are they flagged? And like what I guess and then another question too is what can law enforcement do if this is online but not action yet?
So this is the idea. There are lots of tripwires in which sometimes people in their own communities will make a call to SARS, the Suspicious Activity Reporting Line. There will be tips. There are monitors in which we are looking for, and sometimes we have law enforcement in these communities monitoring the activity and looking for people who are escalating. There are ways this is monitored, but you have to understand when we think about things like apps and signal intelligence, the volume of signal intelligence every day is so immense that it's untenable to actually screen it and do there. So most of the tips we get are actually tips made live where someone has become aware of a person's behavior. There are ways to do this electronically, but they are so overwhelmed by volume that they cannot be, you couldn't consider them kind of first line in terms of intervention. So yes, these things are monitored, but I have to tell you this, right now, especially with AI, the big tech companies, the big social media companies have dropped their guardrails, and the government is encouraging to drop their guardrails and their content moderation so that we can compete more effectively with China, for example, in the big global marketplace of the technologies and things like AI. So the idea that this would be caught by someone monitoring social media platforms, apps, etc., pretty low probability. Most of these are human intelligence in which we get reports. And we have had reports from partners, law enforcement partners overseas, who say, we became aware of this person communicating with these groups. You probably need to have eyes on them. So that kind of stuff is happening, but it is, the system is flooded. All right. So again, just in the interest of keeping our happy Monday moving along, I'm going to jump over to humiliation. This, again, as an increasingly important risk indicator. All right. We're listening for the person in school, the person in the workplace who feels humiliated. Now, again, very quick description, shame. Shame is something, any of us feel internally. I'm ashamed of something I said, I didn't do. Humiliation is when the shame becomes public. Other people know about that. What we see, and think about this right now in the context of layoffs, of the economy, of all different kinds of things that are happening in the world around us. what we know is when we see humiliation, it magnifies grievance. It adds to whatever existing grievance structure is there for the person. And again, can start to create a much more significant risk profile for us. Now, I want to go back one or two slides. I'm sorry that I jumped ahead a little bit. But you'll remember that in our pathway model, grievance was the entry point to, to the pathway. And Jacqueline points out, again, and this is very true of almost all of our schools in New Jersey, using Gaggle on the school computers, on the Chromebooks the kids are given, which is very good, a very good software program for picking up these kind of risk indicators. But we're also talking about people in the workplace, the community, who are not necessarily being monitored by Gaggle. But Gaggle's a very good example. Thank you for bringing it up, Jacqueline. So you'll see again, grievance as the entry point to the pathway. Remember, I also said before that lots of people just stay aggrieved. Lots of people start to form violent ideations. Fewer people go on to actually do anything. If we look at this FBI study, this is a 2018 study known as the Pre-Attack Behavior of Active Shooters, study done by the FBI. You'll see adverse employment action, adverse academic action as some of the more significant risk indicators or grievances that get someone started on the pathway. That was a smaller study, an N of 63. But this is where I want to go with you right now. This is relatively new research from the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. And what we saw in the comparison of active shooters, people we were concerned about being active shooters, being on the pathway, was the people who actually had humiliating events as part of their story were 4 times more likely to execute the violence than people who did not have humiliation. So that ought to jump up at you really strongly. Like when I am listening to a story and the person has lost their job and they're desperate and they're hopeless and they're angry at their employer and they're angry at their stupid boss who fired them, but they were humiliated in the workplace as part of that process of losing the job or what led up to it, that is a risk magnifier. So we see humiliating events as potential pre-incident or pre-attack indicators in this way. When the person feels persecuted, becomes defensive, becomes reactive in this way. Now, this is kind of just one quick step into the underlying neuroscience. This is pretty interesting from Chester and DeWall. And they identified a specific part of the brains, the nucleus accumbens, which they think, and this is part of the kind of pleasure reward center of the brain, that when individuals, and this seemed to be more true of adolescent males, when individuals fantasize about taking altruistic punishment, that creates the same pleasure circuitry in the brain that fuels them, So if we've been humiliated and we start to fantasize about retaliating against our boss or the bully at school or the principal who suspended me, this becomes a self-reinforcing and self-accelerating loop. So I want to give you an example that you'll know. If we talk about Luigi Mangione, who was the killer of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare back in December, now 2 years ago. His initial writings that have been made public, things like these guys had it coming to them. He saw the industry as being predatory, the healthcare insurance industry. He saw the CEOs as becoming fabulously rich on the back of people who were being denied treatment and care through their insurance plan, et cetera, et cetera. So Mangione's thinking would be an example of altruistic punishment in which he thought he was doing something good for society by 1, taking out Thompson, and 2, sending a message to the other CEOs of the big healthcare executives, you're on notice that we're coming for you. And then you saw people, and you still today, some people championing Mangione. So there's some really interesting underlying neuroscience about that neurocircuitry of pleasure and reward around that specific kind of fantasy. Now, when we think about workplace violence, for example, just go there for a minute. Type 3 workplace violence is worker to worker, current or former worker against a current or former employee, employer, their boss, etc. We know that many people who lose those jobs, feel pushed out, feel mistreated in the workplace, can smolder in that hostility for many, many years. I want to give you an example. This is a case that I had worked on at a distance. A guy walks into the federal building at the corner of King Street and Varick Street in Soho. Very hot Friday afternoon in August 1989. No, this is 2018. Friday afternoon, 2018. Walks in the door at the corner of the building, just cuts loose, shoots and kills the guard, shoots the place up, ultimately turns the gun and shoots and kills himself. He had been fired from that office in 1989. The shooting is in August 2018. That's an indication in some instances of how long people could be out there smoldering or marinating in the anger and frustration that is attributed to this humiliation of how they feel they were hurt, they were mistreated, they were humiliated. Now, there's so many possible scenarios in the school, the workplace, the community. In the workplace, it could be things like, negative relationships, the school or the workplace, disciplinary actions in the school and the workplace, corrective actions on the job, things like that, in which the person, it happens in kind of a public way. And I'll give you some examples of that. For example, you're called out by your boss in front of your coworkers in the meeting for something they believe you messed up and, really ridiculed and humiliated. And you feel like, how am I ever going to regain the confidence of my supervisor, my coworkers? This is so damaging to me. So when this is kind of poorly handled by other people, and think about us in America, it's kind of a fairly unique American trait. We so identify with our jobs. If anyone asks you, hey, hey, Steve, who are you? What are you about? Oh, I'm a mental health professional. I do this, I do that. The first thing that comes to mind is our work or our job. And when that feels threatened or we feel undervalued, especially for us, that's very powerful sort of stuff, very damaging and very hard to come back. So it seems like humiliation in general raises risk of aggression. Humiliation, of course, seems to be worse when it's at work or school and it's public and sort of in front of other people, compared to, if it happens in a home or the community. Obviously, humiliation is pretty subjective. What's humiliating to me and you may be very, very different. But we see this in the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit study that it does increase this risk. And you saw that 4 times more likely to carry out the violence. And I gave you this example before of a coworker being humiliated by their boss in a team meeting, in which it's very hard to come back from. So here, there may be additional risk factors combined with humiliation, like a person that has a brittle personality type, who is very easy to offend, who doesn't have much in terms of resilience or coping. Every little thing that's said to them, they're very hurt by, they're very reactive to. That can, again, magnify the effects of humiliation. That brittle personality tends to be someone who is acutely hypersensitive to perceived slights, even if they're not real. And notice the last point here, suicidal feelings are not uncommon in these instances of humiliation when the person feels they'll never regain their status or their reputation, etc., whether it's school or work or other places. Now, the thing that's kind of new in our world, obviously social media is not brand new. The role of AI is something different and more so. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But when someone is humiliated online, Amy is asking, brittle personality, typical trauma response. It can be associated, Amy, not exclusively. That's a deeper discussion, and we'll catch up with that, or email me, or just, you know how to reach me. We'll talk about that. But now it's posted online, the humiliating thing. And this is where you're starting to see some states and certainly some countries start to limit the access of teens to social media platforms because of how it's messing with things like body image and development and how people control each other and humiliate each other online. And we've seen these kind of social media facilitated suicides in which people have been outed or shamed in some way in social media channels, and the whole world gets to see this. So because it happens in social media, the net is cast that much more widely, and it becomes very hard to take that down, to take that offline, and a person can stay, being reminded of humiliation for a long time. So the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit has generated 8 questions which they're encouraging us to ask in behavioral threat assessment if we believe humiliation is a factor in the person's story. Now, I know in psych emergency, you're not doing necessarily the same exact kind of behavioral threat assessment, but in your risk, dangerousness assessment, your risk of violence assessment, et cetera, think about where some of these questions may fit if you hear themes of humiliation. So let's look at those questions here as kind of wrapping it up. And I'm going to backtrack to the former employee, which becomes trickier because on top of the humiliation, they have, for a lack of a better term, lost their anchors. They don't feel part of something anymore. They don't have the social supports in the workplace. They don't have the financial support of the workplace. Again, this person is very unmoored if they have both a loss of their job status and the humiliation. But let me kind of wrap up by getting to the questions, the 8-week questions. And the 2 or 3 slides I just kind of passed over really quickly. I'll try to circle back to, but remember that you have access to the slides. So the 8 questions recommended by the FBI are these. How global, how widespread is the individual's status, loss of status related to the humiliating effect? Is it just a couple people at work? Is it everyone in my company or my school is laughing at me? I can't get people to sit with me. I can't get people to talk to me. People keep harassing me and tormenting me and making fun of me about this. Is it something that's online and the whole world has seen this? Now, I want to circle back for a moment, although this is not the main thesis of our discussion this morning, is you're seeing more AI-generated porn, right? We're aware of this concept where people's faces and images can be pasted over all kinds of really horrific, explicit stuff. And someone who is never involved in these activities could be, made to be involved in anything through the use of generative AI. So this stuff can be incredibly damaging to people, and they could be humiliated now by essentially fake news, by something that they did not even do, but has become so widespread, the concept here in question 1, so global throughout their community, online, that they feel incredibly hurt and damaged, ashamed, even they didn't do this, and feel like they have nowhere to go. So the correlation to suicide risk may be very real. The threat of reacting to other people and aggression may be very real. Second question, has the humiliating event generated feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, despair, or suicidality? Are they kind of on a downward spiral personally and professionally? And mom and dad tells us about their teen, since this video was put online, since this meme was put online, they can't get away from it. People just keep reposting it, and they're going down the tubes emotionally. So are they on that downward spiral because of the humiliating material? Has the individual been marginalized or ostracized because of the humiliating incident? Kind of a stigma now attached to them because of what they did in the humiliating circumstance, whether it's real or it was just artificially generated. Are they being blocked out? Because now, of course, that isolation and the lack of social support is going to complicate things. From the perspective of an employer or school administrators, how important is the community in which, to the subject in which the humiliation occurred? Well, they're not really part of that group of people. They really don't care. It's not that damaging. Oh, this was their team. This is their circles of friends. And I mean, team could be their group at school, their group in the workplace. And they have lost face with that whole group that was so important to them. They were very collegial. They were very supportive of each other. Now they're not, now they're, not helping this person. In fact, the reaction to them may be even more damaging. Question 5, how public was the humiliating event? Did lots of other people know about it, see it happen, become aware, or is an entire community and beyond? And I talked a moment ago, is social media a factor in publicizing it even further? Number 6, how publicly supported or sanctioned is the individual's degradation? Meaning, do the employers, do the school administrators, are they, supportive of the person? Are they, not being helpful in protecting this person and correcting, the kind of humiliation? Are there any kind of life losses that are likely to compound the humiliation? So you're listening to, at the same time this is happening, are there financial stresses, relationship stresses, other kind of other kind of problems a person's having that are compounding, where now the humiliating event is kind of icing on the cake. And lastly, does the person have options for status recovery? Oh, I can take this offline, or I can, have the boss or someone correct this with the team so they know that they could speak on my behalf, that I should still be trusted. How do I kind of rehabilitate my image or my reputation? Is that possible? Or is it completely irreparable? And there's no way I could undo the humiliation that I've endured. Obviously, that would be the worst case scenario. So let's circle back for a moment. I want to recommend this to you because we went through humiliation pretty quickly. I gave you the link, and this is a one sheet we call QLDs, Quick Launch Documents, in the FBI from the Behavioral Threat Assessment Center and the Behavioral Analysis Unit from the FBI that talks about in depth the role of humiliation. The FBI is saying to us, when we're concerned about violence risk, self and others, the research is increasingly talking to us about humiliation as a meaningful factor that we should be listening for, looking for. I want to end, though, with our couple minutes left by mentioning, if you have not been made aware, and lots of our screening centers have been in contact with us, myself and some of my colleagues in the FBI have been on the road over the last few years. I haven't done much of this since the pandemic, but we started this a few years back. Randy helped facilitate myself and Scott and a number of people from the FBI and Homeland being out there talking to different groups and talking to screeners. The development of the New Jersey STAT team, the statewide threat assessment team. The way this model was set up is, one, it's multidisciplinary. It is a combination of law enforcement, mental health, legal people, child services, the Department of Education. I mentioned FBI, Secret Service, et cetera. We have all the players in our area of operation combined, and we meet usually weekly, if not more often, to hear cases that are referred to us. The way the system was envisioned was kind of like our medical trauma center, where the STAT team is one centralized team for the state that represents maybe the highest level of resources and capabilities. We're developing at each county level through the prosecutor's office, county-based teams. And those are more inclusive. They include representatives, hopefully, from the screening center, other mental health partners in the community, and then, of course, the educators and all the others that I mentioned. And then the level 3 teams are mandated right now. You may recall back in September, I want to say 2023, that new law went effect from Governor Murphy. Every K through 12 public school had to have a behavioral threat assessment team to look at this problem of targeted violence. So all these teams are in different degrees of development right now and working together. So you have a place where you have a nexus with a situation where you believe someone's on the pathway towards targeted violence, you could make a referral and draw upon these teams. Conversely, we have cases in which we're working with someone where very clearly there may be a mental health crisis, and we need to involve the screening centers for outreach or other partnership to do this. And many of you have been part of this already, and increasingly we're doing this. And obviously, we're going to work within all the bounds of HIPAA and our normal confidentiality. We will never push you as screeners or screening centers to do anything that you should not in terms of sharing of information or working together in this. But this is kind of the law of the land. These are teams that are developing everywhere across the U.S. to respond to and be part of what's referred to as our National Targeted Violence Prevention Strategy. So I want to finish with a couple of things as resources. One is, if you don't get it, the Journal of Threat Assessment and Threat Management comes out from the APA, American Psychological Association, and ATAP. If you are not a member, you're interested, there's a wonderful national and international organization known as the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. Lots of the folks in this group are mental health workers and are mental health crisis workers. So something to look at, because the journal comes out quarterly. It is all the research arm, all the peer-reviewed studies and writing on threat assessment and targeted violence prevention. And then another group, obviously, I'm with, and we do a lot around New Jersey with, which is ENTER. It is a National Threat Evaluation and Reporting Program, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security. We're out there in your communities. We're doing training. We want to get you involved, and we want to share information like we did today. because honestly, I do. I do, but we all in the threat assessment community, one, recognize your level of expertise already. And this is why today is kind of an advanced training, introducing emerging trends like nihilistic violent extremists and humiliation, not baseline stuff, but we want to get you on board, have you understand these concepts and be able to work with us where appropriate. So listen, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Maureen, I'm going to pass it back to you for any closing comments or to facilitate any kind of questions. You could do it online, offline. You could keep the recording going
No.
or turn it off, whatever you'd like to do.
Steve, thanks. Thank you so much for being such a great colleague to the TLC, to our screeners, to all of us here in New Jersey. We're so blessed to have you, and we so appreciate the Disaster and Terrorism Branch. Also, the partnership with the Traumatic Loss Coalition and the screeners to be like, hey, we're all in this together. Thank you for presenting stuff that most of us are like, this is scary shit, right? And we need to be aware. We can't put our heads in the sand and not know that it's out there. So thank you for sharing. Everyone, thank you for being here with us and your attentiveness. And we will send out, even though it was in the chat, we will send out the material Steve gave us. Hey, happy Monday morning, right? Hey, we're stronger together. We're going to keep our kids safe. So thank you, everyone. Happy New Year if I haven't seen you yet. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Maureen. Thanks, everybody. Be well. Have a good